Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the third video in the GUM UI tutorial series. In this series, we are doing a deep dive into the GUM tool and soon GUM code. For a quick refresher, GUM is two things: a program or a tool that lets you build a user interface or UI like painting or image editing tool. So what you see is what you get. It's also a NuGet package and a code library to pull your UI that you've designed into your application or into your game. Previously in part 1, we downloaded and installed GUM. Then in part 2, we went over variables and units. This video will continue to discuss the GUM tool that allows you to build the UI elements of your game or application. We're going to talk about 5 things today: GUM updates and releases, components, states and categories, the Nineslice standard element and why it's so powerful, and then at the end I'll have a bonus of something for sprites. As always, the chapters are marked and English captions should be auto-generated, so jump around as you need to. Now for the updates and releases of GUM. Vic has released 2 major updates, adding over 70 improvements, fixes, enhancements, or changes. As we can see here, there's a November update, a list of all the changes that have been made. If we scroll up, we can also see all of the updates that were in the December update and all the bug fixes. So if you want to know specifically what happened, specifically what changed, that's where you can go. I wanted to highlight 2 of the updates that I was involved in for these last 2 releases. So in the first update that was performed, I actually wrote the code change and submitted this one. So if you remember, you can add a guideline by clicking somewhere here on the border, and you can add these guidelines that you can use to kind of help figure out where you need to align your UI elements. Before, though, you had to click on it and drag it all the way to the edge to get rid of it. And so what I added is if you just right-click it, it will disappear. It'll delete that guideline for you. Second thing is that the undo system now has a redo system. And there's also a history tab down here. So as an example, let's just create a screen real fast. Call it test. Let's add a bunch of components. Add a circle. You can see it says I added the circle instance. If we change this, we can change these different unit values. We can change the actual exposition. And every time we change these things, it's showing us the history. And then just like most applications in Windows, you can press Control-Z to undo. And as you're undoing those changes, you can see that it's showing you where you're at in the undo history. And once you get back to the beginning, you can actually press Control-Y to move forward through those changes. So that was a big change that was made, and I just wanted to show that. And it's not because I'm not trying to boast about myself, but to explain that if you see something in GUM you want changed, the developers and the contributors to this project will listen. Submit a ticket on GitHub. Get involved on the Discord channel. Vic wants GUM to be as useful as it can, so if you have a great idea for an improvement, please reach out. Okay, next up are components. I wanted to go over these because a lot of future videos will involve using components. Essentially, a component is just a packaged set of elements. They can be standard elements or even other components. And you can mock up an entire UI element as a component, such as a health indicator or a text box or a button. So for instance, in this right here, you can see I can put a colored rectangle and a text box together inside of this component. Now, if I wanted to move this component around, I'm going to move both elements together. If I change the size of it, these are going to be applied to the entire set of components. I don't have to worry about separating these out and manually controlling them. Additionally, what you'll see in the next section, this allows me to have something called state because I'm using this component. So how do you create a component? Well, first, we're going to right-click on components and say Add Component. We'll just name this My Simple Component. That's it. Now you've created a component. You can drag different standard elements in there. So I could drag in a circle, or I could even pull in my other component into here. And so now I've got a standard instance and a component inside of my component. Another aspect to components, or any elements really, is that if you see that there's variables, so for instance, let me add in here a text element. So now we've got a text element in here. We can see that the text instance has different variables or properties that relate to it, like the text that's being displayed. But if we were to add this, so let's add a screen, and let me drag this up here. Now that we've added this as an instance, if I scroll down and up, this instance of my component, I've got position, I've got width, I've got all these other attributes, all these other variables that we can change. However, there is no text. I cannot change this text. So that's not good, right? It's just going to say hello forever. So the way that we can change this on a per instance level is we have to expose the variable. So to expose the variable, we would go back to the component and to the specific thing we want to expose. We want to expose the text variable inside of the text instance. Here it is. I'm going to right click and say expose variable. I'm just going to call it text because we're not going to have multiple different text instances inside of here. So it's okay just to call it text. And now if we go to the component level, we scroll down to the bottom, there's this section called exposed, and we can see we now have a variable called text with the value hello. And sure enough, if we go back to our instance, we can see that on the instance, it also has an exposed section and the text variable. So now we can change this to goodbye. That changed. We can drag in a second instance of our component. One says hello, the other says goodbye. And so now we have exposed that text variable so that we can modify its contents. The next thing I want to talk about are states and categories. What is a state? We can see on the screen here we've got states. A state is essentially a way to combine variables. So if we go and click on one of these instances, a way to combine the different variables, the different units, or the different settings into a single named item. So I could have a state that allows me to set multiple different variables all at the same time. This makes it so you can easily change between the different values without manually setting all of them each time. So for instance, if you wanted to have a component called my component, and we had a colored rectangle in there, I don't want to have to manually change this to 15. Let me get it on the screen. And then change this to 50, and then change the unit type here, and then down here change the width to this. You know, I don't want to have to change all these different attributes, all these different variables at the same time, one by one in code. I'd rather just say change to this other state, and that state would contain all the different information to change all those variables. So a common example would be to create a button. So if you have a button, the button might have two different states, whether you've pressed the button or it's in the released state. But the button could also be enabled or disabled so that you can't press it. Now, each of these is a different state. You can only have a single state active at any time within a category. So if you need to be able to have it pressed and enabled at the same time, we need a way to have both of these states apply at the same time. And this is where categories come in. So what is a category? A category is a grouping of states. And while that's almost the only point of a category, however, it also makes it so you can have multiple states active at the same time. Because if you remember, you can only have a single state active per category. But if you have multiple categories, that means you can have multiple different states set at the same time. So how do we create and use states in a category? First, I want to say that states and categories attach to the component or to the screen. They don't attach to the individual instances of standard elements in your components. So they're in fact on this primary component or primary root screen if you create them. And I'll show you that here in a second. So let's create our first component and category, and let's create two states. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to add component, I'm going to name it example component. Now that that's created, I'm going to drag in a colored rectangle. So now we've got this created. And now that it's created, I'm going to add a category. So under the States tab here, I'm going to right click and add category. We'll call this one Quick Styles. And now I'm going to right click this category and I'm going to add some states. So the first one will be big, and then the next one will be small. So now we're going to define the settings for each one of these states. So the settings are changed or defined by selecting. By default, this is what your thing would look like, your component. But if you want to change what happens in a specific state, then you have to click on that state, and you can see now I'm editing the state variables for big, or I'm editing the state variables for small. So we'll go to big, and we're going to select the color rectangle instance, because those are the variables I want to change. I'm going to make this large, so I'm going to say it's something like that. It's a big rectangle now. And I'm going to set it to a bright color also. Let's do that. So let's set it to something bright. Let's do, I don't know, bright and orange. So bright orange day. Now let's also change the behavior of what happens when it's small. So I'm going to click on small. You notice that it's now set back to default. And this is because when you set the values for one of the states, like we did for the big one, all those same values will be now hard-coded for the other states. For instance, we changed the width of it and the height of it. You notice that these are no longer green. They're no longer the defaults. We also changed the color, which means that these are no longer default. And so if we go back to small, we can see it has the original default values, but they're no longer green. They're no longer default, meaning that they are now hard-coded for this instance. So for small, we're going to change these ones. Let's go ahead and change this one to a smaller, like maybe something like this. And we'll change the color to blue, bright blue. And then we'll do one more change. We'll also change the alpha, because we haven't changed that yet. Let's just set this to 100. And the point of this is just to show you that even though the states are within the same category, the states don't have to modify the same variables. You can modify different variables in different states, even if they belong to the same category. So for the big one, we only modified the size and the color, but for the small one, we modified the size, the color, and the alpha, the transparency. And when I click on these different states, you can see that those variables, those values we set, are retained. If I go back to default, here's what it would look like if we did not set the states. But if we're using one of these states, it would change the way it looks. I'm going to create a screen. We'll call this one example. And I'm going to drop 3 instances of our component on here. The first one, we're going to leave it the default. The second one, I'm going to move over here. And then the third one, I'm going to move down here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change the state so we can get we can see what it looks like in game or in our program. So here's the second instance up here on the top right. If I scroll down, I can see there's a section here, and that section has no name. But even though it has no name, this is the section where the states can be selected. So we can change this to big. We can go to the other one and we can change its state to small. So now we have the same component placed 3 times, and we're not manually manipulating the values. We're using state to change what these things look like, what their attributes, their variables are. Finally, I just wanted to hit home that one piece of information that the states are actually at the component level, not really down here at the instance level. And to do that, what we'll do is we'll add a text instance. And what we'll do is we will change what text this is. Let's just change this color to black. We'll change what it is in the other instances. So by default, it's going to be hello, but we'll change that to default because it's the default state. And then when we're on the big, we're going to change it so that instead of it being default, it's going to be big is the word. So we know that we're in the big state. And the small one, we're going to change that to small. Again, this is just to show you that the state is not defined at the instance level. I don't create a state and a category on the instance. It's being created here at the component level. So this component retains the state for the entire component. Going back to the example, we can now see that those text boxes are representing their correct values on the screen. Next up, we got Nineslices. What is a Nineslice? Well, this is a standard element that draws an image on the screen. So here we got a Nineslice. It draws it on the screen in a way that preserves stretching along the horizontal and vertical paths of the edges. What the heck does that mean? Well, let me pull up an image here to try to explain. So in a normal situation, without a Nineslice, if you have this image and you were to stretch the width and the height to scale it up, each pixel is going to get larger in every position. And so it looks like this. It's all fat and distorted. With a Nineslice, when you scale it up, it stays the same. And that's because it basically splits the image up into 9 sections. You can think about it that you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the middle, 7, 8, 9 at the bottom. And so what happens is the corners, 1, 3, 7, and 9, those are not scaled or stretched at all. They stay the same size no matter how big you make it. And then the top and the bottom, 2 and 8, those are only stretched horizontally. 4 and 6, those are stretched vertically. And the middle part is the only part that is blown up or distorted by this process. Generally, this is left a solid color to hide the fact that it's being distorted or scaled up. So Nineslices are useful for tons of things. text boxes, message boxes, buttons, scroll bars, and many other UI elements where you want a border around your component. How do we create a basic Nineslice? So let's go ahead and create a new component. We'll call this button. We're going to drag a Nineslice standard element in there. I'm going to drag a text instance in. And I'm going to update the color of the text to black so we can actually see it. I'm going to change the text to click me. Click on me. All right. Now we're going to have to pick the image because we don't want to have a red X. We want to have something useful or important. So I made a quick image off screen. I'm just going to grab that image. Let's just grab this one here. There is our image. And you'll notice as I make this larger, it's not changing at all. That's what we want. We don't want the outside single black pixel to keep getting larger and larger and larger. If we scroll down, you can see that we're using the texture address of the entire image. So this is a single image or a single file. Here is what that image actually looks like. So it is quite small in comparison. As I zoom in, you can see that the purple is actually pretty small in relation to everything else. I mean, this is it. There's a pixel here of red and black, and then white and purple. But the edges are retained. If I hover over the Nineslice, zoom in a bit more here, you can see it easier. You can see that there's these rectangles that represent those different regions. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Let's talk about creating an advanced Nineslice. So we'll edit the Nineslice from the button to use a tile sheet instead of a single image. So right now we're using that single image. So we'll select a tile sheet that has more. And you notice now we have 4 images of 32 by 32, and this is a 64 by 64 image. I don't want to display all 4 of those images. So what I'm going to do is change this from texture address entire texture to custom. Now you can see there's 3 different ones. Entire texture. This is good if we want to use a single image and it's not packed. It's not a packed image with multiple items or multiple images like a tile sheet. Unfortunately, we are using essentially a tile sheet with multiple images, so entire texture is not what we want to use. Next is custom, and this is the most powerful. You can specify where in the image or tile sheet you want to pull the texture from. You can even specify the exact border size for the frame down here. So let's get it on the screen first. It's going to be a 32 by 32. And so I just pulled in that first top left image from 0, 0 down to 32, 32. While I was manually setting these, that's not the easiest way to work with this. If I go to this texture coordinates, make this larger and zoom in a little bit, we can see that I now can select where I want to pick from that tile sheet and display which section inside of my Ninesprite. Because this is a 64 by 64, and each of these is a 32 by 32, I can say snap to grid, change this to 32, and now when I drag this, I can instantly change, as I zoom out a little bit so you can see, I can instantly change between these 4 different images to use for my Nineslice. And that's pretty powerful. The last option is what's called dimensions-based. And dimensions-based, it essentially uses the size of your Nineslice instance, its width and its height to pull from the source. So if I was to take my Nineslice and I was to shrink it down, this would change those values. Our image is a little bit of an odd image to use for this though, so I'm going to go back to custom so that we can be using this top left section here. It defaulted back to 64 by 64 because we went to that other view. I find that I use the custom the most, the entire texture the second most, and I use dimension based the least, but all have their specific purpose. Now a little tidbit, using a single large tile sheet or texture like this, let's say I had, 50 or 100 different images. If you do that, it can be more performant because we only need to send a single texture one time to the graphics card instead of multiple round-trip batches of sending sprites or images to the graphics card from the CPU. So for instance, in something like Monogame, this would be like performing multiple different sprite batch begins and ends every time you change a texture or image. So if you can, make sure you put all of your images into a single tile sheet to save on performance whenever you're sending something to the graphics card. Now, how about states and Nineslices combined? Now that we've got these 4 different images in our Nineslice, we can take advantage of this. So we can make it so that we have 2 different button styles, red and blue, with 2 different backgrounds. One background for the pressed state of the button and one for the released state of the button. So I'll create a category for the button called style. Again, right click, add category, style. We'll create another category. This one we'll call selected. I'm going to add 2 states to the selected. We'll add in pressed, and we'll add in released. For style, we'll add in 2 states as well. We'll add in red, and we'll add in blue. We're going to modify the states now so that they can look a certain way for the button. For the blue style here, we're going to go to the texture coordinates, and we're going to check mark snap to grid, which we already did, and make sure we're on 32. And what we're going to do is we're going to move this to this other state. So now when we're blue, we're going to look like this, versus when we are not blue, then we look the other way. As you notice, if we go back to the red state, because we did that dragging behavior, even though nothing really changed here, it set all of these to hard-coded values, and they're no longer defaults, including in the blue state, even though all we did was change this from left of 0 to left of 32. Even though that's the only one that changed, it hard-coded the other ones. If you click on the category, we can see that it now shows all the variables that are being modified. But if you recall, we're not actually modifying all these variables. We want them to remain the defaults if they can. The only thing we changed was for the blue state, we changed the left position. So let's get rid of the top, the width, and the height, so those remain at the default every time. And sure enough, we can see that they are now green again. They are now default again. The red state, because it was already in the default position, already has the red style, so we don't need to change anything there. Now let's modify the selected states, pressed and released. So let's make the top here when it's the released state, and we'll make the bottom the pressed state. So let's go to the press state, and we will do the same thing as before. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here, and we will make it so the press state is essentially at the bottom. Now again, going back here, all we really modified was the top. We don't want to change the left position, the width, or the height. We want to leave those the defaults. And the reason why is that now, if we look at the styles, selected will only modify the top position, and style will only modify the left position. And this is exactly what we want, because then these two different categories, when combined together, can modify the combined visual representation of this button. Now we need to test it. So if we look at the button here, I can't really test it. I mean, I can say pressed and I can say blue, but you notice that nothing really changes. Even if we do combined state, nothing is really changing over here, right? So what we have to do is we have to drop this into our screen to be able to modify those values. Gonna undo those. Okay, let's drag our button in. We're gonna go down here and we're gonna select pressed. And because the default was red, that's why it's showing this, but we can also hard code the state style to red. So now we're in the red pressed state or the red released state. We can also try the blue released state or the blue pressed state. And so hopefully now you're seeing the power of categories and states where I've now used a Nineslice to pull a specific image out of that Nineslice and use that to show different images depending upon the states that are set for the button. We're into the bonus section now. So that was a lot of information, right? I got one more bonus item for you, and that is sprites. So what is a sprite? Well, a sprite is a term given to a 2D image in games. There are other more detailed or complex terms, but that's basically it. It's a 2D image. That's what a sprite is. They can be useful for tons of different things. We can use them for icons, for logos, for background images, for previews of game levels, for loading screens, and also, and this is the reason why I wanted to include it, for tiling an image. So we'll only cover the tiling aspect in this video, so see the official documentation for details about sprites. Specifically now, let's talk about how to tile that sprite. Sometimes when you're placing an image in your UI, there may be a situation where you want to repeat an image multiple times. As an example, let's just pull up Paint, and let's create some really fancy artwork. There's our fancy artwork. Well, let's say we wanted to repeat this over and over again in a tiled fashion. We just want to keep doing it over and over again. There's no interruption. There's no change in this pattern. But we don't want to place hundreds of these objects, hundreds of these sprites on the screen over and over and over again. It would be better if we could just tell the computer, tell the graphics card, hey, take this image and just repeat it for this width and this height. And you can do that. We can do that in GUM. So first, let me go ahead and drop a sprite into the screen. So here's a sprite, drop it on the screen. Get the button out of the way. So now that we've got this on the screen, I'm going to select the file. I'm just going to select the example sprite frame. Okay, I've got that on there. Next, I'll change the texture address. So down here again, I'm going to change this to dimensions based. And I'm going to change this to wrap. I've set the texture width and scale by default. It's set to 1. And that means 100% of the image. And watch what happens when I start dragging the width of this around. So now we can see we've got it tiled. I didn't have to copy this and place it. I didn't have to make multiple instances of the sprite. With this one feature, I can tile all of them. And that's a great help. But you can also change this. You can set it as like 0.5. So now it's half the width of the normal size instead of it being the full 100% width. You could do that here as well. make this half the width. Or you can make this 2 times as large. So it's very powerful if you need to repeat an image with specific scale options. Hopefully that is something that you find useful. I thought it was pretty nice. Let's talk about how to use states with a sprite. Well, they're not really that much different from what we just talked about for Nineslices or any other standard element or custom component. Using states is essentially the same. All you're doing is setting the variables. That's what the states allow us to do. So I'm just going to drop this sprite we made into the button and then change its visible property for the press state to true, just again so we can see that yes, you can add this. Yes, it can rely on multiple different objects in the state. So let's click on this. We'll drag it into the button. And then I'm just going to change this to something smaller, like that. That looks nice. We'll do that. This is completely nonsensical. It doesn't mean anything, right? Why do you have this repeated? I don't know. It doesn't mean anything. But the point of it is just to show you that these can all be combined. So again, we're in here. I've now selected the sprite instance because I want to modify the variables on that. And then what we'll do is that when we're in the pressed state, then it will be visible, which means that in the released state, we do not want this to be visible. So where's the released state or the visible state? Here it is. So in the released, it will not be visible. So now let's go up here and let's play around with our button a little bit. Click on our button and we will change this to released. And we can see it goes away. We can change it to red. It doesn't come back. Change it back to pressed and now it shows up. Doesn't mean anything, but I'm just trying to show you again that you can combine multiple things and the states and the categories are at the component level and you can use those to change the variables on the items in that component. With that, I'll say, before we go, remember, try to use components as much as possible so you can reuse similar UI functionality. Expose those variables to increase reusability. Second, that states and categories can help you make quick work of complex changes that you want to make to an object later on in your game. So don't try to hard code setting 16 different variables for it or managing that in your code. Instead, make a category, create the states, and make it so the state controls the changes to your objects. Consider using Nineslices in most of your UI components for performance and also for just the ease of use. Lastly, sprites are useful. Remember that. You can use them for icons and logos and background images, all the things I said before. But the thing that I wanted to talk about in the video, as you recall, was about tiling, which I think is extremely powerful. There's that tiling aspect here. Please comment below on your thoughts. If you've used Gum yet, let me know. If you haven't, try it out. Provide your suggestions in the comments for the next video. One of the items I want to talk about in an upcoming video pretty soon is going to be how do you actually use this in a game? And that was one of the questions on one of my previous videos. It's extremely important, right? I mean, yeah, you could spend all day building a UI, but if you can't use it, why does that matter? So one of the next upcoming videos, if not the next video, will be how to pull this into Monogame specifically, and how to display it. Thanks for watching.